Once again, please take your seats. The program's due to begin. Please take your seats. The program is due to begin soon.
Panel.
Your lecture series has made such an impact on the institute. Um, so um, we we're joined today by Adrienne Brodeur, who leads the Aspen Words program and also has written the memoir "Wild Game: My Mother, Her Lover, and Me." And if you haven't yet heard about this book, you must not be uh, on the internet because there's reviews everywhere, there's television appearances everywhere. It's so powerful, the response that Adrienne's memoir has received already. She's going to be interviewed by Erika Mallin, who leads the Aspen Arts Program based in New York. So it's a what Shakespeare would have called a marriage of true minds. Aspen Arts, Aspen Words. Um, it's exciting that we have with us today Elliot Gerson, who recruited both of these colleagues to the Aspen Institute, and so the proud recruiter in the room. And I had a chance to read Adrienne's book when it was like the next to last version. It was like this, but it wasn't quite finalized. They were typing or whatever, proofing, and I was totally, completely mesmerized and blown away. I read it in 2 sittings, um, and I was really just so astonished by the insights and also by the artistry through which you reflect on and tell your life story. Um, and it sort of left me thinking about two big thoughts, and then I'll surrender the mic. The first one is that the experience being described here is obviously Adrienne's experience. It's her take on her life story. And she describes a childhood in which she became um, captive to a particular um, way that her relationship with her mother was framed by her mother. And there's this great line by Emily Dickinson: captivity's consciousness sows freedom. Somehow, in that journey to adulthood, having been brought into a way of seeing the world, your life, what you were supposed to be doing as a child, you ended up having a worldview that then you ended up breaking through. Captivity's consciousness sows freedom. And that's very particular to this story. But we're all captive to some forms of consciousness. Every one of us is living within a circle of constraint in how we interpret the world through the lens of our experiences or our condition to see what's around us. And we're all on a journey to try to um, have freedom as consciousness coming out of some form of captivity as consciousness. Nobody is just always only illuminated. I think it's so fascinating how you could read this book and imagine then the journeys of other people uh, that have had some frame put around their way of seeing the world that they later had to chip away at and knock down and break through. And so it's really inspiring because it makes you think, do I need to break through a frame around my worldview? Um, that was one thing. That was one thing I took away with this. That's why I loved it so much. The second thing was that Adrienne and I are actually about the same age. You have a brother. I have a sister. So you're the age of my sister. I'm the age of your brother. So I was reading this as like, kindred spirits here because we grew up in the same time. We grew up in the 70s. And there's this paragraph that you wrote that's been in my head since you wrote it. So I've just got to read it because it was like, wow, how amazing. I now see something about my own life a little more clearly. It's on page 28, where she writes, "The prevailing wisdom concerning divorce, my parents divorced, at the time, was that children were resilient creatures who would fare far better with happy parents. That was the new paradigm, or at least it was the version of it that our parents embraced and we helped spin." And I can't tell you how many times that was how I interpreted the circumstances of my childhood. That it was better for me that my parents were divorced because happy parents were better parents, and I was better off because they were happy. And so get with the program and be happy. Because if I would just be happy, they'd be happy. If they were happy, I'd be happy. It was just so insightful. Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, with that, Erika, take it away.
Dan, thank you so much for that. And I think just following that, one, it's an honor, a privilege to have you here. Everyone in Aspen is so proud of you. You're a superstar, and we all want to be you and aspire to be you. But I think what Dan, to lead with that is, you have this very, very unique story, yet so universal. And I think that's what makes great art, but also to thank you for sharing it. It is a memoir, so you are truly sharing your life as you saw it, and that, as we often talk about, is very brave. And being an artist requires a huge amount of bravery. With that, though, I just want to give you. You do have Adrienne's bio, but I'll give you a quick rundown. So Adrienne has a long literary background. She co-founded with Francis Ford Coppola Zoetrope, which was a magazine that was award-winning magazine. And she also served as a judge for the National Book Awards, which you told me you had to read over like 400 books for. And also directs Aspen Words, of which I don't know if everyone knows this, but this is one of the highest gifts or awards that a writer can get for an influential work of fiction. So we're very proud to have that program, for you to run it. Your father was a veteran New Yorker writer, and your mother was a food and travel writer who published several cookbooks. As you will see when you read this, you'll know why, and wrote for the New York Times, among other magazines and papers. Adrienne will be on a whirlwind whistle-stop tour for the next 2 months, promoting her book. And I also, to just, brag a little bit more, Adrienne, I just wanted to read, Adrienne's success. I'm trying to make mine. Anyway, but the New York Times, I don't know if you read the review, but I don't know if it gets better than this. Here's a portion. The book is gorgeously written and deeply insightful, and with a line of narrative tension that never stops from the first page to the last. That is one that you will likely read in one delicious sitting. So this is a must-read review and a must-read book. So
Thank you.
It's a pleasure and an
Thank you
honor.
so much.
So with that, let's start from the beginning, since the book hasn't been out. It just hit, and
2 days ago.
2 days ago, and you can buy the book here today. So since it hasn't been out, I think it'd be good if you could just give us a synopsis without, spoilers.
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you all so much for coming. I've run Aspen Words for about 7 years, and I've invited all sorts of authors and interviewed them, and I never once pictured being on this stage, being the one interviewed. So I really appreciate that you're all here. Wild Game tells the story of my very complicated relationship with my mother. And it starts, the opening scene is in 1980. It's set on Cape Cod. Picture a very hot July night, and I am 14 years old, asleep in my bedroom upstairs. My parents, my mother and my stepfather, had had a dinner party with friends of theirs, old friends of theirs, the Southers. And I had gone to bed, and at some point around midnight or a little bit later, I heard my door open. I heard my mother come into my room, and she woke me up to let me know that my stepfather's best friend, Ben Souther, had kissed her. And what I didn't know at that moment was that this would turn into an epic love affair in her life, and I would be sort of swept up and involved in it for the whole time. But what I did realize in real time, as that moment was happening, that there was a before and an after to my life. And I had gone to bed as my mother's daughter, and I had woken up as her best friend and confidant and sort of co-conspirator in this love affair. So I'm going to read just a short piece from that opening scene. I think the only thing you need to know is that my mother's first name is Malabar. She was born in India. And her husband is Charles, and then there are Ben and Lily Souther. Ben becomes her lover. Let me just get to the page. Oh, and my nickname is Rennie. So, wake up, Rennie. I felt a hand on my shoulder and pulled the sheet over my head. Rennie, please. Even before I turned and saw her face, I could hear a peculiar quaver in my mother's whisper and smell the remnants of the Pinot Noir. Her voice sounded hesitant and desperate. The mattress sank where she lowered herself beside me, and my body stiffened against the depression. I kept my eyes shut and steadied my exhalations. Rennie. The whisper, more urgent now, still held an unfamiliar tremor. She pulled down the sheet. Please, wake up. At this, I opened my eyes. Malabar was in her nightgown, her hair mussed. I sat up. Mom, what's wrong? Is everything okay? Ben Souther just kissed me. I took in this information, tried to make sense of it, couldn't. I rubbed my eyes. My mother was still there beside me. Ben kissed me, my mother repeated. A noun, a verb, an object, such a simple sentence, really, and yet I couldn't comprehend it. Why would Ben Souther kiss my mother? It wasn't that I was naive. I knew that people kiss people they weren't supposed to. My parents had not shielded me from stories of both their transgressions during their marriage, and in this way, I knew more about infidelity than most children. I was 4 when my parents broke up, 6 when my father remarried, 7 when that new marriage started to fall apart, and 8 when my mother was finally able to wed Charles, who'd been separated from but still married to his first wife when they met. Ben was married too, of course, to Lily. The Southers had been married for 35 years. Mom and Charles, Ben and Lily. The 4 of them had been couple friends for as long as my mother and stepfather had known each other, about a decade now. Wait, what do you mean Ben kissed you? Suddenly, I was fully awake. I pictured her slapping him in response. That was something my mother might do. What happened? We took a walk after dinner, just the 2 of us, and he pulled me into him like this. My mother crossed her arms around herself, simultaneously demonstrating Ben's caress and embracing its memory. Then she collapsed the rest of the way onto the bed, smiling, and stretched out alongside me. Apparently, there had been no slap. I still can't believe it. Ben Souther kissed me, she said. What was it about her voice tonight? He kissed me, Rennie. There it was again. Joy. A tone I hadn't heard from her since before Charles's strokes. Joy had fallen from the night sky and landed in my mother's voice. One kiss, the gleam and shine of it, what it might portend, had changed everything.
So I think so this secret, that you carry with you goes on for, almost, for very tough periods from adolescence through college to being a young woman. How much distance did you need to start putting the words down?
Right.
No, I mean, it really...
Well, one of the things that I should say is, of course, in hindsight, I think I'm thinking what all of you are thinking, which is, something like, good Lord, what a burden to put on a child, how, what a terrible thing, how must she have handled that? And, I have a 14-year-old daughter myself, and I regularly look at her and sort of think, like, what on earth would possess a mother to do this? However, if I were to be honest about how I experienced it as a 14-year-old, I mean, it was unquestionably the most exciting thing that had ever happened to me in my life. I was overnight, first of all, my mother's, all children want their mother's love and attention. Suddenly, like, the high beams of her love were just beaming, shining on me. And it was also thrilling. I mean, I just entered this adult world. It was full of intrigue. There were close calls. I felt like the girl behind the wheel of the getaway car. I mean, we had this sort of mother-daughter Thelma and Louise thing going on. And kind of, even though we knew we were, like, destined for a cliff, it sounds so odd to say, it was great fun at the time. So, yes, much distance had over decades. I mean, that night was 40 years ago. And so, wait, your original question was how long did it take?
Yeah, I mean, because it went on for so long.
Well, I think, there was no crisp and clean moment, like right now, at this point, I was ready or not. I did try to tackle it in many different ways. I always kept a journal. And so, my journal became a whole lot more interesting after that night. But I also, I've always been a writer. I tackled it in some pretty thinly veiled and not particularly great short stories when I was in my 20s. I tried to deal with it in humor, both in story writing and in conversation, which I think, often we deflect really painful things in humor. But I think the game changer for me was starting a family. And I think I was under the impression that I had done some good work in therapy and through conversation and through reading a lot, and this was all way in the rearview mirror. But when I had children, that was just an eye-opening moment in your life. I mean, having children requires revelation. I feel like nothing in my life has ever changed my relationship to my past and my future more than becoming a mother. I mean, just in the moment, everything has changed. But I knew with certainty I didn't want to mother as I'd been mothered, and I knew that I had a lot of work to do to really figure out, to sit with it and understand it and acknowledge my role in it. And also, in my family anyway, it wasn't just a one-generation thing. This legacy of deception and lies had gone back several generations, but my mother's father had a secret family outside. So my mother found out in her young life that she had an illegitimate half-brother. Her mother had a very similar affair to her affair. So it was just, in my childhood mind, like, this is what I thought adults did. This is just what seemed normal to me.
Right. So in addition to sort of a culture of secret keeping in your family, I think I think we all, seek our for especially I think for girls, seek your mother's approval and your father's approval. And I think in that moment where you describe that and beyond is this very, the high beams of her love on you at a time when she was not very happy. And,
yeah, I think that was the other thing.
Right, you were sort of really leaning into, trying to be there for her.
Yeah, well,
it seemed so innocent in a way that you just wanted her love back.
And wanted her to be happy, and she hadn't been happy for years. And suddenly, as I described, like, it was just like the first time I'd heard joy and happiness in her voice. She was so excited. She was a changed person, and she was madly in love.
Well, and you also said, I just wanted her to be a mom like everybody else's mom, like drive the carpool, and clearly she was not that. And I don't, I don't know, it seems like a few mothers do that, but, you wanted to sort of, leave it to be her mother, and she was just not that. And
Malabar was not.
No, it was as far as possible. But that really struck me that you wanted to give so much to her in that moment for both her love, but both in empathy or sympathy.
Yeah.
At the same time, you were going through your own adolescence, and I guess, I don't know if I would call her in a way, it was sort of an adolescence for your mother, but you were going through adolescence at the same time.
Right. And I think I got really diverted, instead of focusing on my own separation and my own, experimentation and all the things that you typically do. I had to do that like 20 years later. I was a slow, late bloomer.
Yeah, no, I think it really did sort of, rob is a hard word, but I think you really sort of, there was a fork in a road and there was one way to go. And, that must have been incredibly hard. But I do think you were trying to give her some sort of love that she didn't have. And so I think, so there was some distance. The book has just come out, and you have written about it in various pieces. And you have said you felt this, incredible, special moment when she tells you this. But you also talk about having your moral compass being, really messed up by this sort of, constant. You were what your mother called her secret, the secret weapon to keeping this affair alive. It was over a decade, this affair, and you really did, there are very much times where you really did direct the show.
Different
places. And you said, let's do this, and, made it happen for them. And at the same, and then talking about your moral compass sort of being shaken by that and sort of moved around. I myself felt complete sympathy for you. I think you knew what you were doing wrong. So I don't know about your moral compass, but why do you speak of it like that?
Well, I think, we only get one set of parents, and so my childhood actually seemed normal to me, of course. I mean, all of our childhoods seem reasonably normal to us. And so when I say I didn't really have a moral compass, I just feel like when I think about the way that my husband and I sit down with our children and actually have conversations about what's right and wrong and why you want to think about someone else's feelings, like those were not conversations I had. So, and the fact that I didn't at these moments really, certainly not in the beginning, have some, oh my gosh, I'm doing the wrong thing. It really took a long time for me to understand that I hurt people, that I was contributing to, things that I feel a lot of shame and guilt about or have at different points in my life. So no, I think that I had to develop my own moral compass as I grew up and got distance and space from the whole thing.
Yeah. I guess, I sort of poke at this a little bit because of the idea of the deep-seated need for parental approval and love, especially when there's sort of distance already, and with, a mother who is incredibly accomplished, but who is very focused on her own life, and just almost doing anything to kind of, ensure that. And I think you sort of get tired of it over time a little bit, and you and as you read the book, you'll see it takes a toll, as it should. But what was it like to keep these secrets from your close family, your brother, your stepfather Charles, who you were very close to?
And actually, most of my friends, and I think the corrosive, there's so much that's unhealthy about keeping secrets, obviously. But I'd say if there's the worst thing about keeping a secret, especially a secret like this, is you keep yourself from being known. You cannot actually have completely intimate and loving relationships because I'm not showing you this huge side to myself. And so while I might have great friends at this time, they might not know why, I'm disappearing every night, not going on to the next party, because my role was to come back during these test dinners, these cooking sort of big parties that my mother was having with the Southers, because I had this role of being sort of the innocent 14-year-old chaperone who'd be like, hey, let's go for a walk. And both their spouses were quite ill, so they didn't generally join us. So it's, I'm sure my brother was quite hurt without really understanding why, that we'd been this close little threesome, and suddenly my mother and I are like, having a lot of conversations. He was a year and a half older at the time, so he was also 16 and going off and doing his own thing. So I don't know how aware, but I know, on some level, something was going on that he wasn't a part of, and we had been pretty tight as kids.
Yeah. Well, I think siblings are often sort of witness to the family, and he was being shut out a little bit, and so that's always hard. But let's talk a little bit about Malabar and how you and Malabar is still alive, although ill, but she was an incredibly accomplished woman for that time.
Yes.
She's an incredibly accomplished chef and cook, and we can talk about the name of the book. But I have to tell you that I was starving through the entire book because Adrienne describes these meals that, you got to get the recipes, and but she really was an accomplished woman, and despite sort of what she was, there is a point where you say that, Malabar knew what she wanted, and she went out and she got it, essentially. But tell us about her, and maybe you want to find a place to read either. It is lunchtime, so maybe people will be all right, but, let's take us there for a second.
So, You know, my mother was this very glamorous, very charismatic woman who, as Erika just said, was astonishing in the kitchen. So she studied at Le Cordon Bleu. She worked in the test kitchen of Time and Life Foods. My entire growing up, we had test nights because she was testing for these cookbooks she was writing. And she had a food column for the Boston Globe called Do Ahead Dining. But so, you know, where my brother and I might have been praying for mac and cheese, that was not something that was ever on our table. But as she proceeded into this, the section that I'd like to read is about a year later. So the affair has been going strong, but my mother is always desperate for more time with Ben. You know, they're still conducting this sort of affair in plain view. It's these couple friends. And she's just like, how can we get them here more? How can we do this? And she came up with kind of a brainchild, brainstorm of how to accomplish this. And I'm trying to think of what else you need to know. What else you need to know is that her lover, which might give away the title, but her lover, Ben, was an avid recreational hunter and fisherman. So he and his wife had come up for another one of their weekends visiting my mother and stepfather, and he had come bearing venison and venison liver from some recent hunt. And we're still on Cape Cod, and our house is right on Nauset Bay, and it's the fall. Malabar was still in the kitchen when the rest of us put on jackets and went out into the crisp autumn air and sat in a semicircle around the deck table, its center umbrella lowered and strapped for the season. The sun was making its descent behind us, casting long shafts of light across the harbor and creating the illusion that the marsh grass was on fire, glowing golden from beneath the surface of the water. From inside, the whir of the Cuisinart sounded as my mother blended the liver and vegetables, no doubt adding chunks of soft butter and salt flakes. Across the wind-swept bay, we heard terns screeching, and suddenly dozens materialized before us and dived toward some underwater disturbance. Then the surface of the water broke with a thrash of fins, what my father called a bluefish blitz, and thousands of minnows leapt to escape, the fish hunting them from below, only to be snapped up in the beaks of black-capped terns above. I studied Ben as he observed the carnage. His body twitched the way some men's do when they watch a football game, imagining that they are catching the pass. I could tell he would have liked to grab a rod and dash down to the water, which is what my father would have done. But instead, he heard the rapping on the slider and turned to help my mother, who stood on the other side, holding a large, round serving board. They beamed at each other as she slipped past. The birds dispersed, and their feeding frenzy ended as ours began. Malabar lowered the artfully arranged pre-dinner offerings, paper-thin slices of ruby red venison carpaccio under dollops of horseradish creme fraiche, a bowl of wrinkled and briny olives, 2 triangles of overly ripe cheese oozing past their soft rinds, and a dish of her ethereally smooth venison pâté tucked in beside a collection of cornichons and slices of pickled onions. The tray was a thing of beauty, each delicacy separated by sprigs of rosemary from my mother's herb garden and garnished with lilies nasturtium flowers. Malabar admired her handiwork and let out a hearty laugh. If something on this board doesn't kill us, I'm not sure what will, she said, raising her glass to salmonella. Legionnaires, Charles toasted. I raised my glass and took a big swig of ginger ale. Bring on the bacteria, Ben said, taking hold of my mother's free hands. He kissed her palm. Malabar, I can think of no better way to go than to be poisoned by you. The ice-cold soda got stuck on a knot of remorse in the back of my throat. Lily registered my distress by rolling her eyes at me, a look that I took to mean, I'm not worried, so don't you be. Pay no attention to these old fools. Seeing Lily's lack of concern, I relaxed a bit. Still, something on my face had given away my concern, and I felt sick that Lily had seen it. Stupid, I chided myself. and I willed Ben and my mother to be less obvious. Malabar spread generous scoopfuls of venison pâté over thin slices of toasted and buttered French bread and placed one round onto each of our open palms as if bestowing the host at communion. We popped them whole into our mouths, the flavors and textures settling over our tongue as the whipped and gamey layers revealed themselves in slow motion. Heavenly, Ben said, his words muffled around his mouthful. Charles nodded. Wait, everyone. I have an idea, my mother announced dramatically, bringing her hands down on the table. I perked up. This was my cue. My mother and I had practiced how to mortar each brick into this storyline, and it was critical to get Charles and Lily on board. This conversation could not be solely my mother and Ben. That wouldn't look good. My role was crucial. Malabar took a leisurely, palate-cleansing sip of her power pack, which for those of you who don't know is a very dry Manhattan. Her audience leaned in. What do you think about, she paused here for effect, a wild game cookbook? I took another sip of ginger ale and waited a beat. Charles's eyebrows lifted in contemplation. He was no doubt imagining what the next year of test dinners might promise. He'd been enjoying the fruits of Malabar's labor with her do-ahead dining column, but this had not always been the case. Early in their marriage, my mother had agreed to put together a charity cookbook for the middle school that Peter and I had attended. The other parents, decidedly unsophisticated cooks, submitted recipes and for one very long year, Malabar tested the gelatinous one-dish casseroles. Charles would come home in the evening, take a look at my mother hunched over the stove, the telltale red notebook on its stand, and cringe. Sweet, no, not another test night. What exactly counts as wild game, I asked now. Sounds a bit gross, just meat, and more meat. Oh, Rennie, not at all, my mother said. Our cookbook can be whatever we want it to be. It should definitely include seafood, just look at the bounty out there, and vegetables, the type you can forage for. Lily, you could teach me about mushrooming. Lily smiled at the thought of having a role. But who would buy it, I said, playing devil's advocate, my tone hinting that the adults were out of touch. Not everyone has a hunter in their midst. You guys are the exception, not the rule. All this, I pointed to the tray of appetizers, is not exactly normal. Normal, my dear, my mother said in her most regal voice, is not something I've ever aspired to be. Okay, fine, Mom, you're not normal, but not one kid at my school eats pheasants or rabbit. There will be like 10 people who will buy this book. I disagree, Rennie, Lily said. I exhaled. She had taken the bait. Think of all those people who are becoming dismayed by the food industry these days, with how we raise our meat in this country, she continued. The chemicals, the pesticides, the conditions. Hook, line, sinker. My mother blinked Love My Way, Morse code style, and Ben tapped his knee against mine under the table. Brilliant idea, sweet, Charles said to my mother, and he reminded us that his children all love to hunt and fish. Count me in. Me too, Malabar, Lily said. What fun it will be. Do we have a title? Charles asked. Ben and my mother were silent for a moment. They looked upward as if a title might fall from the sky. How about something simple, Malabar said. We could call it Wild Game. It tells the reader what to expect, but promises adventure too. It's perfect, Lily said. Ben touched his glass to my mother's. To our wild game, Malabar. Oh dear.
Oh dear is right.
Oh dear indeed.
So aside from what's sort of the undertone going on there, which of course makes you want to read the book even more, but you know my stomach is grumbling already. But after I read
for the poor vegetarians out
right,
there, I apologize.
Right. No, I was ready to eat anything that Malabar was going to serve up. But the one thing that really struck me also, because you are a writer and both of us deal in the arts, was and I think I wrote to you about this after I read it, is the 3D-ness of this writing, the cinematic. I mean, in that short reading, you've been on the beach in Cape Cod with the fish and the minnows. You've gone back into the house, and the meal has been described to, this mouth-watering tea. You see the dialogue and hear and smell and feel everything. The dialogue, sort of running smoothly into dinner, into then the wild game, with also this sort of undertone of sex, essentially.
There was a lot of that.
Romance. All in that. I don't know how many pages that was, but I had a journalism teacher at journalism school once. He wrote for the New York Times. He said, you have three voices. You have the one that you think in, the one that you speak in, and the one that you write in. And if you can bring all of those together, you have mastered, at that moment, a journalistic piece, but also I think as a writer. And I think that example is it. It's as if all of those have come together, and we're in it, we feel it, we touch it, we smell it, we think it, we know it. And I'm, what is your process? What is the secret sauce of
First
this?
of all, I just want to say thank you. That is
that's
so
so
such a
vivid.
nice compliment. I don't know what the secret sauce is the truth.
But what is your process?
My process. Okay. Well, what I will. I think, first of all, I have been an editor, and I've been in this universe of writing and literature for a very long time. And I think if there's the single greatest advantage I had, or the single greatest way I learned to write, because I don't have an MFA and I didn't go to school for it, is that I read voraciously, and I read everything, and I'm interested in how writers put these things together. Personally, I think, I feel like there are two different types of writers. There are writers, I listened to Elizabeth Strout the other day in an interview, and she's like, yeah, I don't have a plot, I just write, and I write, and I write, and then, you scale back. And I'm somewhat the opposite. I knew the scenes and the beats of this book were the only thing I knew. I knew I needed to start with the kiss. I knew these various moments, these big dramatic moments that had to be in there. And then a lot of the work for me was threading them together. The sensuous writing, I mean, what you gave me such a nice compliment on, is just really was the environment. I mean, the Cape and my mother's kitchen was a place where you tasted and you smelled and you touched, and you just felt all of that. And I wouldn't know how to describe it without doing all of that. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, I mean, it's hard to talk about your process.
Yeah, but like the actual process of like, when did I get up and do it, or that type of thing. I mean, I was, I have this job I love, you might have heard, and it's a busy job, and I have 2 children, and I have a husband I love. So really the only time I could find for myself that I had is in the wee hours of the morning. So I actually had the great fortune of going to a writing residency, and I was there for about 3 weeks, and I continue to feel grateful to the Institute for supporting me and having some time off to do that. But I came back thinking, well, gosh, that was amazing. I got a chapter written, and I wonder when else in my life I'll have 3 weeks to myself, like maybe in another 10 years. And a writer friend of mine who, for the record, doesn't have children and is a Zen Buddhist priest, was like, Adrienne, what you really need is to touch the manuscript every day. You need to stay with it. And my thought bubble was so mean. I was just like, easy for you to say. But the fact is that was possibly the best bit of advice I got. And initially, if normally I had to be up and at it at 6:45, I started by getting up 15 minutes earlier, 30 minutes earlier, and then the first number and when I woke up each day was 4. I got up at around 4:30. And just so you know, because I know you think that's crazy, it is the secret hour that everyone should know. No one can bother you. You can't think about your to-do list, like you're not even in that mode. you're still close enough to this subconscious that just your ideas flow so incredibly well. And when I got into that pattern, I really had a draft within a year.
I think that's interesting, and also the struggle of being a mother, a wife, and really trying to find 20 minutes
and having a career and a job.
And a career and a job, and I think people underestimate that with many women writers who have that. I want to ask you one of the things that you talk about in the book, and is how books kind of saved you.
Yes.
And so you started to read, what seemed to be everything starting from 7th century literature onward, in sort of a very short period of time, and from classics and others. But tell us how that saved you a little bit, without sort of giving too much away.
No. I mean, it really did. Yeah. And what I will say is that I was not one of these precocious little readers who had the flashlight under her under the blankets as a child. And I think in some ways, because I had writers for parents, I was like, anything but that. And I didn't want to go down that road. But when my father got married for the 3rd time, he married this lovely woman who owned an independent bookstore in Del Mar in California, and I was living in California at the time. And every single time I saw her, starting in my early 20s, which is when I got to know her, she would press a beautiful novel or two, or a book of poetry or nonfiction into my hand, and something just changed in me. And I would read these not just as the beautiful works of literature that they are, and these were books by Barbara Kingsolver and Zora Neale Hurston, and just, the gamut. But it was, the very act of reading, of course, is an empathetic act. You are in characters' heads. You're seeing how those characters get over their struggles. They're put in all these different situations, and much more complicated than my own. And it just, I don't know, it just allowed me to kind of open up the possibilities for myself and see different ways of handling myself in the world. And yeah, I feel like if there were 3 things that kind of helped me claw my way out of the confused state I'd been in, and the confusion was followed by a very severe depression for several years in my 20s, where I was really, really not doing well. It was therapy. It was finally putting this secret behind me and developing very close relationships with female friends and having those conversations that we all need to have. And then last but not least, reading, just reading and reading and reading.
Was there one writer who has influenced you the most, or you feel closest to? I do feel
honestly,
like writers
not.
are friends.
At different points, I could tell you the writer who influenced me the most for this book. I mean, there are different writers who influenced me at various times. When I started to write Wild Game, obviously, I love reading memoir, and I love lots of the great memoir. I think, Elizabeth Alexander for poetry, Mary Carr for her voice, Jeanette Walls, who wrote The Glass Castle, just for her compassion for her own deeply flawed parents. But the writer who I actually took a line and taped it to my computer is Vivian Gornick, who wrote, in addition to a mother-daughter memoir and many other memoirs, she wrote a book called The Situation, the Story, which was this almost how to write narrative nonfiction well. And of course, there were all the main things, don't settle scores and be hard on yourself. You have to be as hard on yourself as you are on anyone else. But the line that I loved so much was sort of in reacting to Mommy Dearest and why that book didn't work. It said, in order for the drama to deepen, you have to show the loneliness of the monster and the cunning of the victim. Like, you have to show both of these things to make it beautiful and real and authentic.
No, I think that speaks very much, that tension is very much alive and well in this book, to the point where it's tough to read, because you were absolutely cunning, and she was absolutely empathetic in some ways. And
Yeah.
there's always tension in writing that you need to bring forth. What are you reading now?
I just finished, and if you haven't started or read it yet, Chanel Miller's Know My Name. She is the young woman who was raped by the Stanford swimmer, and she had no voice. She was Emily Doe this whole time. The boy was convicted on 3 counts, but the whole trial revolved around his wonderful past, his promising future, his swimming speeds. And this woman was just, why had she had so much to drink that night? I mean, she was the one on trial. And despite the fact that he had 3 convictions, I think he might have spent, a month in jail. It was horrific, but it was so great to hear her voice. And it's such a powerful voice. Read it. It was good.
So finally, have you forgiven Malabar? Has this been a cathartic thing for you? She's still alive. What have you come to in this moment?
Right. That is a very big question. I will say, going back to having children, I think that which you don't heal from, you're at risk of transmitting. And I definitely didn't want to transmit this any further down our family line. I developed a great deal of empathy and compassion for my mother in writing this book, which isn't to excuse what she did. I think we're all better than our worst moments, but I also think that, in a way, there are all these moments you feel like, is this fair? Is how I portrayed this fair? Well, I chose to start with this moment of my mother's kiss. That's all from my perspective. How differently might any reader feel if I started, for instance, from the moment that my older brother, her first child, died in her arms? Mm-hmm. Then everyone might think, wow, she's been through so much. She went for love. She's this strong woman. She's a survivor. So I have forgiven my mother is the long and short of it. These events took place a long time ago. We had great periods of difficulty, for sure, periods of estrangement. But I think I've forgiven her in order to let go of it. I think I've forgiven her not to sort of blanket over or cover up what she did, but in fact to underline it and move beyond it. I mean, I think forgiveness is actually very self-empowering.
Have you forgiven yourself?
I'm getting there. Yeah. I'm getting there. That's harder because there are never any quite so clearly drawn lines in the sand. Like I'm over this. I mean, I actually think people ask me a lot about the book, or sort of now that you're done this. I mean, I can assure you, I will be having conversations in my head with Malabar long after she's gone, as far as I know, till the end of my days. But that's okay.
I mean, again, I think we go back to sort of the mother-daughter relationships and our relationships with our parents, that sort of, as complex and as strange and often as, toxic, but also as loving, that we always strive for. And I think you've taken on this topic. Yes, there is this story, and that is very compelling and romantic. In fact, you do have a movie deal in the works because it is such a great story. But as I said from the beginning, it's a universal story too, because we are complicit in many ways with our parents, and particularly as we grow up, because we don't know anything. And what you've done here is made this story, this personal story, obviously, compelling, but also so universal. Malabar and all of these characters in here are parts and pieces of all the people we know. And so I think that is why this book is speaking so much and so well, and why you also must, read it in one sitting, and because you can't stop.
Thank
so
you.
it's I don't know if there's anything else. I guess, is there a final advice you would give to a secret keeper or a parent, a writer? You've talked about the special hour, the 4:30 in the morning for writers.
The 4:30 hour is key.
Which is interesting.
Also, read as if your life depends on it, because your writing life does depend on it.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many, when I ran Zoetrope, which was this literary magazine, how many authors or writers, aspiring writers would send me their work, and I would ask them what they read, and they're like, oh, I don't. And I'm like, So you have to read a lot. Advice to secret keepers: don't do that stuff. Or certainly don't involve others. I mean, we all do what we do in our lives, but I think keeping a secret, me whispering, this is what I'm doing over here, it might seem like this intimate act, but it's sort of a false intimacy, because I'm in fact sharing a burden, and now part of whatever corruption I've just given, you have to manage now. It's complicated. I don't remember the last thing I'm supposed to give advice to.
Parents, but I think you spoke.
I was going to say, I don't know that I've got advice there. Like, mother of a daughter, daughter of a mother, hoping to do better, but we'll see.
Well, you've talked about sort of not wanting to pass that on,
very much
because
so.
it has been a history of deception.
And I think all of our stories start before we were born. So we have to remember that as we're bringing it into our children's lives. These are not... it just doesn't start the moment they come into existence.
No, I think
we carry stuff forward.
That's important for the forever. We all try to do that as parents, or not.
Or not.
Or not. Adrienne, thank you so much for this.
Thank you for having me.
So we did try to sort of limit a little bit the reading and the giving it away, because you really must, read the book. And now we're thrilled to open it up to Q&A. Yes.
Tell us something about your relationship. Tell us something about your relationship with your father and your stepfather. That's what I would like to know about.
Well, my relationship with my father is fine. What I will say is that, it was a different time. Divorce was different then. So I saw him every other weekend. We lived in another state. He wasn't, he was a present parent, but really not, we weren't living with him anymore. And the thing that kind of people keep sort of saying, well, why didn't he know and stuff? But of course, this was a secret I was keeping with my mother. And the last person I could have told is her former husband. I mean, that just would have been, the worst situation in the world. So this is all what I mentioned before about not being known. I mean, I really kept myself. So I don't blame him for, I blame him for some things, but not this.
So what about your stepfather?
And my stepfather. So I had two stepfathers. My relationship with my first stepfather, who was the one I participated in deceiving, I feel very guilty about. I was in his life from the time I was 8 until he died when I was probably 19. And I loved him very much, and he was a very kind, sweet man. I will say, not to throw him under any buses, but so here it sounds terrible. He's the one who's being cuckolded and everything else. He did have an affair with my mother while she was married, and he was married. This was the world that I grew up in. And so, you can judge everyone or no one, but, no one was sort of really holding up their marital vows with any rigor.
Yes.
Yeah.
The comms team has casted this movie before there are even talks of the movie.
Do share.
We want to know if you have any picks or favorites that you're looking out for.
Can I tell you, first of all, the mortifying thing that I want to keep the world from knowing is how few movies I've seen since having children, because that's embarrassing. But what I'll say is, the people I can think of are sort of people my age who will actually be cast for my mother, of course, not me. because one of the fascinating parts about a film is a huge compression. So I'm working with this incredible writer-director, Kelly Freeman Craig, who wrote and directed The Edge of 17, who's actually doing Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. She's brilliant, and she's so nuanced. I mean, she really understands the nuance of this relationship. But she's, I will probably the character who is me is probably, from 14 to about 23 in the movie. This is a big gap in my actress knowledge. But I also, on some level, feel like I'm working with this person at the top of their game. It would be like me telling the electrician how to wire something. Like, I do not know, what actresses are the best for these things. But I am curious to hear your ideas. Okay.
Yes.
Maybe there can be some like Aspen Institute, wager.
I think right here.
Has your mother read the book?
So the question was, has my mother read the book? About 4 or 5 years ago, when I told her I really had to do this and I was going to face it in memoir and write a straightforward story, she understood. I mean, we have an intense bond. And I'm sure it was one of, not very easy for her, but she understood and she accepted it. She's a big chronicler of her own life, so she gave me access to lots of stuff. And for a couple years in the early writing, I read her parts of it. She is very, very ill right now, and this is not remotely on either of our radar when we're together. So she will not be able to read the book.
Yes. Front, right here.
Thank you. So you said, kind of growing up with generational deception, but what has it been like for you opening this up to the public and having, people ask you these questions about such intimate details of your own life and your family's life?
Yeah, good question. It's funny, it's a very different, muscle to sit down and write a deeply personal book than it is to, come out and just share. And I had this hilarious moment because I was in Toronto talking to booksellers and librarians there, and I gave my little spiel, and then I said, do you have any questions? And the guy who invited me turned red, and he's like, oh, Adrienne, we're Canadian, we're very shy, we would never ask you questions. And I was like, maybe most of my events should be in Canada, because here they're like, well, when you did this really lousy thing on page 34, how would you gauge your level of guilt? No, it's hard. It's hard. It's a different. I've got to learn. I've got to learn how to create my own boundaries on what feels too uncomfortable to talk about. And I try not to. A lot of people ask me, "What does so and so think? What did your stepfather think? What does your brother think?" And that's no idea. And I don't try to guess on those. But thank you.
Yes.
I'm curious why she told you and not a friend.
That is a question I've wondered my whole life, and I think part of it, part of it is simple narcissism. I think part of it was I was there. Part of it, I'm sure, was she'd had too much to drink. But even if all of those things happened, I can't ever picture this series of things happening and doing this to my daughter, but I also think if that did, the next morning you'd be like, whoa, did mom ever make a big mistake last night? Can we unwind and not do that? And she never did that. So I think she was actually a very lonely person and didn't have a lot of friends, and I think she trusted me, and clearly I was going to be loyal, and I adored her. She did later tell lots of friends, by the way. This was not a well-kept secret.
No, I just at the age of 14,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about something back to how you process it, and then and because you said that she had this career where she was cooking, and of course, back when you're writing about it, it's also a man's world, kinds of things. So where, not how did you fit in, but where did you fit in when she's telling you this?
No. I think I was sort of the only person in the house that she could have told, and she just needed immediate gratification that night, I think.
Well, there is a part in the book where I think somebody enlightens you. I can't remember which character, that she is, desperately lonely person.
Yes. Well, that's actually,
even though she's surrounded, and doing all these things and in this romance and flitting here and flitting there and
No, it was actually a friend of mine, waitress friend of mine
that's
from
right.
Cape Cod, who remains a friend of mine today, who had dinner over at the house. And I just remember as I was walking her back out to her moped, she's like, I said, thanks. I can't believe none of my friends could charm my mother. I mean, she was just, picture Jackie Onassis. Like, no one was good enough for anyone. But my friend, I was sort of stunned that she'd been able to charm Malabar. And she's like, your mom's just lonely. And I looked at her and I was like, you're crazy. Like, my mom's carrying on with 2 men. She's got a party every week. Like, the lady is not lonely. And I still remember what she said. She's like, no, Rennie, that the loneliness, the lonely feeling comes from not being known, which is very true.
Yeah. Does anyone else have? Oh, yes, I care.
Did your mom ever ask you for forgiveness?
Not in any big, bold way, no. I mean, really, no. I mean, we've tiptoed around and at various points had talks about it and not. I just don't think, I really think she thought we were best friends. I think she sort of gave up her mother role a long time ago and just kind of thought we had a good run of it. And, yeah.
I think one thing before we can take another question, but one thing we didn't talk about was when you would tell people this story, you got a lot of judgment, and there were people who just sort of went out of your life because of that. And right? I mean, is that a fair? I'm trying to think. There was
in the book.
Yes, I think was that maybe your first boyfriend or your
or
your.
Well, no. Well, like what happened with my very first boyfriend is I was telling the story for the first time. And of course, somehow I was telling the story thinking like, oh, this sad thing, my mother didn't mean to fall in love. She fell in love. It's so complicated. And his response was like, holy God, like what a horrible thing. And I was so mad at him because I was still her primary defender. And I'm like, and also this was not like, just so you know all about my first boyfriend. I mean, like, high school dropout, small town drug dealer. Like this was not some guy who should be really on the moral high ground here. And here he was like telling me my mother was, a piece of work and out of line. And I was kind of like, who are you to say this? And but it was the first time I actually heard someone's that kind of reaction to her, and I was stunned. And the only thing I thought is that I hadn't presented it right. Like he had misunderstood because this was kind of, this story of these 2 good people who were actually doing the right thing. They weren't ditching their spouses who were sick. They were gonna stay in the marriage, and they didn't mean to fall in love. It had just happened. I mean, this was all what I heard. It was sort of almost noble. So in the way it had been presented to me and how I bought it as a teenager.
Yeah. Well, and I think when the feeling starts as a teenager, the story develops, right?
Yeah.
It was shocking at that moment to be like, well, what's the problem?
These are heroes we're talking
about.
Exactly.
And so that was so fascinating also about the book. But then how you then later sort of unpack that a little bit and unwind it and get to a very different point in your life. And I think, much courage goes with that as well. Yes. Hi.
We know that.
Wait for the mic there.
We know that kids and especially adolescents are very vulnerable and much impacted by their environment, especially their families. And lying and deception are in the news a lot these days, and it's something we think about with our kids. What insight do you have about what enabled you to emerge from this, all this that you were going through? You wrote about it in your diary. You clearly were going through a lot of challenges thinking about lying and what you were doing, but you developed different values. And how was it that you were so resilient and moved on from that?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure I'm able to answer it fully. I mean, I had physical reactions along the way. I mean, as an adolescent, I had stomach ulcers. I mean, I really was stressed out all the time. I felt that. I had this unbelievable depression, really, something I've never had, knock something before or since, but I mean, just a debilitating 4-year depression that I think was all just trying to cope with what I'd done, where I was, how I was ever going to get out from under and move forward with my life. And then feeling at different points like I'd, gotten to a certain place. And then, as I said before, having children, I talked about this last night, but I had this moment when, like the day I gave birth to my daughter, she is hours old in my arms. And I was so excited to see my mother and introduce her to her first grandchild. And I'm at Mass General, and the elevator doors sweep open with that little ping, and I see Malabar, and I want to introduce her, and I open my mouth, and there was this physical crushing. I can't even describe what I felt, but I stopped being able to breathe. I started hyperventilating. My husband looked at me. My face had turned bright red. I couldn't talk. I started to cry. And the nurse kind of, just sort of put us each in our own corners. My mother sat back down, and I went into the room that I was ultimately going into. And when I finally sort of, regained enough to speak, I remember saying, like, what happened? Like, what just happened? Because I'd never experienced anything like that. It was like this collision of the past and future just exploding inside my chest. And, she gave me various, you abdominal surgery, that's a lot of anesthesia, and you might have had a, panic attack, which I hadn't had before. But I paid such attention because it was just a wake-up call to me. But I also got a lot of help. I mean, I'm lucky. I had friends that really were emotionally capable and wanted to talk. And once I realized that I didn't have to keep this secret, I think part of the problem is we give secrets so much more power. The more we push them down, the more these stories just take over our lives. And this was the story that just took over my entire life. And so finally, when I was really willing to sit with it and look at it and be with it, it lost some of its power. And then I just really worked hard. It wasn't pretty. It was a lot of work.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Did you feel a sense of intimacy with your mother, a gift of that intimacy as well as the guilt?
Absolutely. I have always felt very close to my mother, for better or for worse. This is, I don't know if anyone else has sort of insomnia and gets into the loop at night, but usually that loop, I'm not talking to my husband or my children. I'm having this conversation with my mother still. She's just sort of the primary person, and even though it's come a long ways. And also I'll say right now, she's a very different person, and she has been for the past 10 years now. She's sick, of course, but she's expresses gratitude with regularity. She's sweet. She tells me she loves me. So it's, we've come on a very long journey together.
Did you feel in some way that this was a gift of intimacy as well as the guilt that it brought?
A gift of intimacy.
I think her sharing that secret.
At the time, my favorite little poem that I have in the beginning is The Uses of Sorrow by Mary Oliver. And there's a parenthetical, in my sleep I dream this poem. Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift. I love that. But I think about that with her. I wouldn't be who I am if I hadn't, that's all of our lives, right?
No.
So.
Any other questions? Adrienne, I can't tell you what it's been an honor, how much it's been an honor to know you, even for such a short time.
No, thank you.
Adrienne has this incredible way of, everyone is her sister or her brother. No, it's special and unusual, and I thank you for being here. Again, I thank you for sharing this with us, and onward to your tour, and much, much more luck. And again, we're honored and we're thrilled. So
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you, sweetheart.
Thank you.